Well, again, it's good to be here, and my hope, especially if you're visiting, is that you feel safe and comfortable here at church, partly because identifying as a Christian in our culture is not a very comfortable experience. Followers of Jesus today can easily feel like foreigners. And it hasn't always been that way. If you rewind American culture 60 years, things were very different. Blue laws guaranteed that shops were closed on Sundays and no one would schedule a Little League game that conflicted with church services. In Boston, statues were built to honor popular pastors, and city streets were named after important church leaders. And until the Vatican forbade it, many of the local politicians were ordained priests. Back then, it was almost uncomfortable if you weren't a Christian. But today is different. Now Sunday is the best time to shop at Market Basket. And that's only if you don't have 6 other sports events to attend. Nearby Simmons College, they recently announced that saying, "God bless you" to someone who sneezes in the library is a microaggression. Some now consider evangelism, sharing the good news, to actually be a crime, a form of hate speech. Our state Supreme Court just decided that the historic churches here in Acton can no longer receive public funds to preserve their buildings, which isn't good news for the Stowe Chapel. And a new survey shows that public trust in pastors has hit a new all-time low. 75% of non-Christians are unlikely to trust members of the clergy like me. And it's not just that. Over 50% of Christians are unlikely to trust me. Half of you don't even trust me anymore. But have you felt this sea change? Maybe you felt increasingly out of place? Maybe you're embarrassed or slow to admit you're a Christian, or that you even attend church. Or maybe you felt awkward about praying before eating in the lunchroom. Maybe you feel like your coworkers and an extended family assume you must be backwards and a bigot just because you're a believer. Pastor Susan, she shared with me that her oldest son, she was startled one day when the department administrator at the college where he works said to him, "Dr. Butler, I was so surprised to learn that you were a Christian." And Eric said, "Why? Because I teach evolutionary biology?" And the administrator replied, "No, because you're smart and kind." And that happened in the South, which is a lot friendlier to Christians than Boston. It's a different world. But maybe this is just a small taste of what the very first Christians experienced. You know, the earliest Christians were a minority, persecuted by the Roman authorities through marginalization and martyrdom. And it was countercultural and dangerous to be a Christian in those early days, and yet strangely the church grew exponentially in that period, going from a handful of terrified disciples hiding behind a locked door that first Easter to more than 6 million followers less than 300 years later, which represented over 10% of the Roman Empire. What attracted people to devote their lives to Christ when it could be so costly for their lives? Well, it was the love and lives of Christians who followed Jesus by sacrificially serving their neighbors. They shared generously with those in need and cared for the sick and forgave those who sinned against them and rescued babies that had been left to die to raise them as their own. But despite all that kindness and growth, the church remained actively persecuted and oppressed in those early years. But all that changed abruptly in the year 313 when the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. And then his successor, Theodosius, established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380 AD. And almost overnight, the Christians changed from being a persecuted minority to being the people in charge. And we know this. Roman and European governments, they spent lavishly to build huge cathedrals, Cardinals had the power to appoint kings. Christians were able to shape culture and force people to do things our way. Finally, like the church had just won this huge, mighty victory. Or had she? Many historians see this moment as the time Christians started to dominate the state. And then this union between Christianity and secular power, it gave birth to what we call Christendom. And that wasn't without its certain gains. All of a sudden, charity became a celebrated virtue. Hospitals and orphanages received state funding and support. But others point out that this was also the moment that Christianity was domesticated by the state. And privilege turned out to be far more poisonous to true Christianity than all that persecution had ever been. That kind of shouldn't have surprised us. Many of those Christians in that time looked to the monarchies, like you remember the kings in ancient Israel, as kind of a justification and a model for how to wield power and be in charge. But we kind of overlooked the fact that in 1 Samuel, God interpreted the Israelites' desire for a king as a rejection of him as their king, and warned them from the beginning how power could corrupt their leaders and lead them astray. Unfortunately, during Christendom, those lessons were largely ignored because soon it was no longer costly to be a Christian, so suddenly everyone was a Christian, and being a Christian, it no longer required sacrifices or risks. Indeed, within a few centuries of Christendom, not being a Christian involved more sacrifice and risk. And spreading Christianity no longer required these bold expressions of love because now Christians had the sword and could force everyone else to act like Christians, whether they believed or even understood Christianity at all. There were so many new Christians vying to get baptized so that they could get jobs within the government that the church leaders had no time for discipleship anymore and teaching those people what following Jesus actually means. So this was happening. And some Christians in this period, they saw how diluted Christianity was becoming. And so they fled into monasteries or the deserts where they could continue following Christ in ways that were countercultural and dynamic. But most people were just happy to go with the flow. So one could argue that while almost everyone was finally a Christian, at the same time, almost no one was. And it's this kind of uneasy alliance between Christianity and power that's been crumbling all around us in the last few decades, especially in Greater Boston. Though the influence of the church had been waning for decades, especially in our universities, after the Catholic sex abuse scandal broke in 2002, it was all over. Overnight, in our area, pastors and priests went from being the most respected people in society to maybe the most suspect. And people who used to feel pressured to justify why they skipped church, now they had to justify why they even attended church. Academics, they call this new era post-Christendom, which is not the same thing as saying post-Christian. There might just be as many Christians in society as ever. The key thing is that Christians are no longer in power, which creates a dilemma for us and our identity as a church. How do you follow Christ at work when just talking about Christ is unwelcome, if not offensive to others? How do you be a faithful Christian at school when maybe you're the only Christian? How do we witness to Christ as a church when our neighbors, they look at us with skepticism, not trust? I think I've seen at least two common responses, or better yet, reactions among Christians to this new reality. The first is to resistance. We separate the world into us and them, and politicians and preachers, they promise to take back America through prayer or politics. And these Christians, they vote for people who promise to pass laws that require everyone to behave the way we want them to, whether they believe what we do or not. And Christians in this camp seem more concerned with laws than love, and often associate almost exclusively with each other so that we don't have to get polluted by our pagan neighbors. And this response is often branded fundamentalism. A second common reaction is assimilation. Kind of go along to get along. Don't make such a big deal about all this. And besides, materialism, self-indulgence, self-centeredness, all those things favored in our society, they actually are kind of pleasant when you indulge them. So let's not rock the boat and try to stand out. And these Christians may still talk about character or justice and helping the poor, but they're rarely interested in making personal sacrifices in terms of time, money, or popularity in order to bring those changes about. They want to use political power to make other people, society, sacrifice for the poor without it costing them too much. And slowly, sacrificial love for God and others is replaced by tolerance, which really means I don't have to be all that concerned about anyone else. We're each free to do our own thing. And so these Christians, they just want to fit in and be comfortable. As a result, they're nearly indistinguishable from their non-Christian neighbors and their kids. This is a reality we've seen. Their kids probably won't be Christians at all because they've seen in their families how little difference the diluted Christianity makes. So fitting in or fighting back. These are the two most common religious responses to what's going on in contemporary culture. And I am sure that you've all seen and have a sense of both of these options. But what I want to suggest for our church, what I want to suggest to you this morning, is that there's another way. And we know that because of what Kaylin read for us earlier from Jeremiah chapter 29. Let me set the context. It was around 587 BC. And Babylon had come and conquered Israel. Babylon was like the superpower. And what they did is they took the intelligentsia of Israel. They were taken into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar back to the city of Babylon, which was 500 miles away from Jerusalem. And you need to understand for these Israelites that Babylon, and you get this if you read kind of all of Scripture, it represented everything that was evil in the world. It was this horrible place that exploited those who were poor and weak, those who were female, those who were foreigners. And this exile was their tactic. It was a tactic. You see, it was a way for Babylon to increase their power by means of indoctrination. You see, some nations, like the Egyptians, they like to enslave people. Some nations, like the Assyrians, just committed genocide and destroyed people, but not the Babylonians. They would take the best and the brightest from the nations they conquered and then force them to become Babylonian. And this is what we see in the book of Daniel, where these elite young Israelites were brought into the king's palace really to become brainwashed into becoming good Babylonian citizens. And sometimes it took the form of threats of lions and fiery furnaces, but other times it was an invitation to come and enjoy luxury at the king's table. Come on, you want to fit in here. Now you got to put yourself in the shoes of the Israelites and imagine what this experience must have felt like. They longed for the comfort of their own homes back in Jerusalem. And man, this corruption of Babylon around us, that felt like a threat not only to them, but a constant threat to their youth and their kids. Nothing good could possibly come out of this time here in Babylon. So they wanted nothing to do with it. They wanted a way out. And fortunately, they knew they'd be rescued soon from this experience of exile. Because a chapter before, in chapter 28, the prophet Hananiah offers these great words of comfort and hope. Jeremiah 28:2, Hananiah says, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel says, I'm going to break the yoke of the king of Babylon. And within 2 years, I will bring you back, all your stuff and all you exiles, back to the place, back to Jerusalem. The king, all of you, I'm bringing you back. 2 years." That was helpful news. And assured they wouldn't be in Babylon very long, these Israelites are like, yes, let's just keep our heads down, ignore our neighbors, and gut it out for the next 24 months. The problem was, God never actually said any of that to Israel. Hananiah had just been saying what the people in exile wanted to hear. And it's at this point that Jeremiah stood up, the true prophet, and said, hey, a prophet's words are true, Hananiah, only if the prediction comes true. And in this case, Hananiah's words definitely didn't come true. 2 years later, those exiles were still very much in captivity in Babylon. So Jeremiah writes a letter from Jerusalem to Babylon, explaining to the Israelites that they will be in exile in Babylon not 2 years, but 70 years. Those were not comforting words that they wanted to hear. But then Jeremiah went on and said some things that were surprising to those exiles. And that might be surprisingly relevant to us today. Jeremiah 29:4, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, really says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. I want to pause right there. Did you hear what God just said? I carried you into exile. The exile of God's people was not something that was out of God's hands. Nor was it something that God simply allowed to happen. God is the one who did it. Why would God do that? Well, could it be that God actually had a plan? And could it be that God cared about Babylon and brought the Israelites there for a purpose? And if that's true, could it be that God cares about Greater Boston and about Acton and has planted us here, as uncomfortable as it might feel, for a purpose? Could it be that when we feel out of place and without power, like the minority, could it be that God is still very much present and still very much powerful in our situation and is ready to work through us? Many of you know these familiar verses that come just a few verses later in this letter from Jeremiah 29. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. Like, I think I had those on a graduation card once. But did you know in the context, it is not a promise of comfort and security. It's a promise that God makes right after telling them they're going to be in exile for 70 years. So God is saying, hey, right here, in your experience of exile, in exile, I have a plan to use you, where you actually might flourish. And you can find me here. I want you to think about that and how different that is from what we're used to. So many of our devotional books about kind of encountering God, they have all these pictures of like waterfalls and country fields and sunsets and forest glens. And I think God's all in that. But God is saying here, I can be found right here in the midst of a busy secular city that disregards you, in an uncomfortable situation where you're without power, in your exile, and I have a great plan and purpose for you right here. That's actually good news to me. So what is this plan? Look at these next verses. The Lord says, build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry, have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. God is calling them to make Babylon their home. Because it takes time to build houses and plant gardens. When you plant a vineyard, it takes 3 years to get the first grapes and 7 years to grow ones that are finally drinkable. It takes decades to have kids and then see them get married. So clearly God's saying, settle down for the long haul and stop pining for somewhere else. Stop complaining about the way things are. Stop grasping for the comfort and control you were used to back in Jerusalem. And this is why. Because when you stop being so concerned with your own comfort and control and trying to just control your situation, you can actually be freed to consider others. And that's God's key invitation. Jeremiah 29:7. Also, seek the peace and the prosperity of this city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it. This is a little countercultural and harder than it sounds. Right? Imagine someone that you detest or find really annoying. Like maybe it's this kind of that deceptive coworker or a conniving classmate. Well, whatever disdain you feel towards them, that's probably a fraction of how the Israelites felt about the Babylonians. And yet, God instructs, seek their prosperity. Pray for them. That's what Jesus meant when he says, love your enemies. You know, this Hebrew word in verse 7 that the NIV translation renders as peace and prosperity, it's actually the word shalom. And that shalom is a rich concept. The peace of shalom, it's not simply kind of an end to conflict. And the prosperity of shalom is not simply financial wealth. No, shalom is the kind of harmony and kind of just rightness and goodness that God can bring to situations. And so to seek someone's shalom, it's to tend to their overall well-being and their wholeness and their restoration as a place and as a people. It's helping someone flourish and taste God's goodness. And the exiles were called to bring shalom to Babylon. I want you to think about this. Isn't it ironic that Nebuchadnezzar brought the people of Israel to Babylon so that he could indoctrinate and assimilate them? But God's plan all along was that the Babylonians would be the ones who are blessed and changed through the exiles of Israel. And you might be saying, that sounds like a strange, not very good plan, God. But if you're curious of whether it worked, flip in your Bibles to the books of Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. And in all these situations, you had these biblical figures living in captivity, but they didn't clutch after the lost power. Nor did they run away from the discomfort of their situation, and neither did they compromise their character by trying to blend in. Instead, they trusted in God's power and lived obedient, generous lives of blessing that affected entire empires. And it's with that backstory and these examples in mind that the Apostle Peter wrote to the first generation of Christians who were also a marginalized minority in an oppressive empire. And this is what Peter said: "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles." Now that's a strange thing to say because they weren't foreigners. They were Gentiles who were citizens of the Roman Empire, but they now had a higher citizenship in heaven because they were followers of the risen Christ. And Peter is explicitly calling those early Christians to identify with those Israelites in Babylon from Jeremiah 29. He says, I urge you, think of yourself as foreigners and as exiles. And so abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Don't fit in, but live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. And that's exactly what they did. And within 12 generations, the church grew from just a few marginalized disciples to more than 6 million people. Seek the shalom of the city. The reason we're talking about this today is because that is also our call, and it always has been. We aren't supposed to simply fit in with our coworkers and our classmates and our neighbors and our friends. But we're not called to fix them either. For too long, those have been the two alternatives that we had to choose between, and none of us really wanted to make that choice. But I think we're called to something different. We're called to bless people. And as Daniel and Esther prove, this can actually be more powerful than you might imagine. In his book, The Missional Entrepreneur, a fellow named Mark Russell, he researched 12 business as mission groups in Thailand. So these are people who would come into a foreign country and use business as a way to do ministry. Now, 6 of these companies, they focus primarily on developing successful businesses that just enhance the local economy. And although they would gladly discuss their faith, this wasn't their main focus. And Russell called these businesses the blessers, all right, the blessers. But there are 6 other businesses that viewed conversion as their main priority. They were so much more concerned with the spiritual destiny of local residents than with their economic improvement. And Russell called these 6 businesses converters. And this is what he found. He discovered that the blessers did way more social good, employed more people, and raised the level of local incomes, which isn't surprising. That's what they were going for. What was surprising is that the blessers also experienced way more people converting to Christ by a ratio of 48 to 1. Why was there such a disparity? It's because the blessers demonstrated authentic love by improving the lives of those around them, which made their new friends trust them with their spiritual questions as well. You know, I was kind of raised in a church context, and I was raised hearing lots of arguments for the Christian faith that were meant to just destroy my doubts. And I received lots of warnings against the dangers around me, the social dangers around me, which the church is going to save me from. But at the end of the day, it wasn't anyone's arguments or agendas that ever made me want to follow Christ. What compelled me was the lives of the Christians who loved me. It was all the people at my church who just welcomed me into their homes. And they just let me talk and talk and talk. And they listened and listened and were patient. People who sacrificed their time to just invest in me as a young man. Who built friendships with me that last till today. So that when I got to the point of figuring out who I wanted to be in life, it was clear, it was so clear to me, I wanted to be just like them. I wanted the abundant love of Christ and just the joy of their homes that they had. You see, it was love, not the force of any argument, not someone trying to fix me, which made the key difference in my life. So over these next 5 weeks, we want to invite you and remind you how to form authentic spiritual friendships that allow us to love people who don't know Jesus instead of trying to fix them. And we're going to use this acronym called BLESS. And it's an acronym that will remind us of each step of this. And in fact, our kids are learning the exact same thing we're going to be talking about in here over in Kids Rock. And so the idea is that a life of blessing is really defined by 5 patterns, 5 missional practices. And one is to begin relationships with prayer, not an agenda. And then to listen with care, not to impose. And then to eat together, to come around the table. That's where friendships happen. And then to serve sacrificially, show them what love really looks like. And then share your story of how God's worked in your life. We want to learn to love without needing to be in power. And we'll discover that is very powerful. And that has actually always been the Highrock Network's vision from the very first days, going back to 1999. So we got started here in Boston. Our big dream has never been for God to create a holy huddle where we can escape the world together. And if we start doing that, we're doing it wrong. Rather, our vision, and this is the longest church vision statement in history, but it's good. Our vision is to see God transforming every neighborhood and institution in Greater Boston, because we believe God's present in Greater Boston, and we believe it happens through locally focused congregations like this one, who live and love in such a compelling and Christ-like way that our neighbors are challenged to seriously consider the claims of Christ and be reconciled to God and engage in Christian community and serve others in the unique ways God designed them to. All that so that Boston becomes a city on a hill that will be a blessing to the world. Church, we live in a very different culture than some of you grew up in. Christians do not have the political or cultural power that we used to. But I just want to suggest today that that might be a good thing. It might be a good thing. Because after years of being addicted to power, we are now free to be authentic Christians again. Exiles who bless people through sacrificial love instead of culture warriors who try to fix the world through control and political manipulation. We don't need that kind of power. Because as our vision statement says, it's clear that it's God who does the transforming of people's lives. We just have to do the loving. So we'll be talking about this over the next 5 weeks, but I just want to invite the question today, what does this mean for you? In your journey, in your posture, in your relationships? I want to suggest one thing, that it means it's not enough to vote for the right people or take the right stands on social media. We're invited to be the right people. But it's also an invitation to step out of hiding. Have courage that God is with you and has a call for you right where you are. And that call is to become Christians who follow Christ more than our own comfort. People who lead with love instead of power. So the question I just want you to take from today, this morning, is how am I blessing the people around me? if all my interactions are just with my Christian friends, maybe you just need to step into more relationships with those around you. Or maybe if you're just trying to fit in, you have to say, how can I exercise Christ-like love in these relationships? How am I making a difference wherever God has placed me? The company I'm in, the family I'm in, the school I'm in, the neighborhood I'm in, the nation I'm in, the world I'm in. So as we step into this kind of invitation to be a blessing, I just want us also to remember that it's not a call to all right, muster up love and just try to be better Christians. All this flows out of the reality that God is here in our lives. And what does God want to do towards us? God wants to bless us with love. And so today we're going to come again to the communion table, the Lord's Supper. And I just want to declare and proclaim that God is in this place. And He's in your life. And God doesn't want to fix you today. And neither does God want to force any doctrine or choice on you today. I think God just wants to bless you with His love. And so in a moment we'll turn to the table, but I invite you as you come to this table today to come as you are. And to come as a broken person, as a sinner, as one who's maybe fit in a little too much. And ask God to come and encounter you here and bless you and show you grace and fill you up with His Spirit, fill you up with love that then you can offer to those around you.